The format of this event today will consist of the presentation of the book with live music from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And then from 1 to 3 p.m., we will have a special discussion panel with some amazing artists and scholars. And before I begin saying anything about Panama, I need to say a couple of important historical points. You see there that in 1501, it was the discovery of Panama, meaning that people from Spain and Portugal came to Panama, the land of Panama, for the first time. And Panama at this time defined many features of the Spanish trade in the treatment of Africans and enslaved people from Africa, workers of African and Pan-Afro-American descent, and their ancestors became part of Panamanian history through several important migration periods in the 16th, 19th, and 20th century. So the first kind of migration that happened of Africans into Panama was at the beginning of the 16th century. By 1553 and 1558, between those years, a major group of cimarrones, who were Africans who escaped slavery, was established under an African nobleman known as King Bayano. King Bayano led the first revolts of Africans in the Americas. It was between 17th and 18th century, Panama became an imperial port for the black market. And in the 1850s, we have the construction of the transatlantic railroad by the United States in Panama, but this wasn't a military. It didn't involve the military. This was exclusively an economic relationship. And thousands of people from the Caribbean, Pan-Afro-Caribbean descent, came to Panama to construct the transatlantic railroad. And then, of course, what we all know the most is the Panama Canal, which started construction in 1904. And that was actually a military occupation of the country of Panama for about 100 years, until the year 2000. So these were very important points in the history of Panama, but we can see that the African diaspora started to develop in Panama as early as the discovery of the Americas. So this book and this presentation has 3 movements. It's a suite. That's why it's called Panamanian Suite. We all understand what is a suite because we're in a music school, and suites usually have 3 movements. I don't have to explain too much about the suite. So this is, imagine a suite, a historical suite. It may have more than 3 movements, okay, yes, it may. But let's say for these purposes, we have 3 movements in this suite. And the first movement is called pre-jazz. The second movement is called jazz. And the third movement is called global jazz. The first movement talks about the creation of imaginary Panama through music, and the music specifically of the Panama Canal. The second movement talks about Panamanians in jazz, and the erasure of the history of the Panamanian identity from jazz. Chapter 4 talks about tambo jazz and the golden era of jazz in Panama, which is kind of the development of jazz in Panama. And the third movement talks about redressing actions. And that includes different projects that helps Panamanian identity come back to jazz, including a new concept called global jazz, which is something that that was actually developed in part here in Berklee Global Jazz Institute. The 3 movements of these suites are linked by a common theme: the creation and recreation of social imaginaries in the context of imperialism and colonization. And I want to start with the first song called Panama Root Waltz. Panama Root Waltz was composed in 1880 by Ditson and Company, published by Arthur Meilath. Arthur Meilath was the son of a renowned Viennese composer, pianist, and teacher, Heinrich Meilath, who was born in Vienna in 1827 before immigrating to New York in 1867. He was well versed in European music and may have been inspired by Schubert's waltz from the early 1820s. While there is no record why Meilath's reason for choosing the title of the song or whether it was his title or the publisher, a reference to Panama made sense from a marketing standpoint, because by the time the song was written, Panama had developed strong commercial and political ties with the United States, thanks to the construction of the transatlantic railroad, giving the name resonance in the popular consciousness of America, but also the world. Let's hear Panama Root Waltz. The pre-jazz era in Panama brought all this music to Panama and created this imaginary Panama. And the music that I show in the book is approximately from 1850 to 1924. Now, I want to mention that one of the big intellectuals who showed us from the very beginning how to look at imperialism beyond the economics, beyond anything that had to do only with what we could see, but also what we could imagine, was Edward Said. Edward Said clarifies that imperialism is not only about controlling land that you do not possess, that is distant, that is lived and owned by others, but it's also about ideas, about forms, about images and imaginings. And here's where music plays an essential role in the making and remaking of imperial expansion and colonization. In 1893 and 94, a series of songs published as First Blossom were written by Michael de Levante over a period of several years. The book was later revised and published by Alden Brothers in New York in 1906 with the title Panama Songs. The cover of the book shows a picture of a place with palm trees, and underneath a quote, "My home is where the tropic glare is, where glory crowns the palms." The songbook is dedicated to Dr. Amador Guerrero, first president of the Republic of Panama. And some pieces in the collection have dates of productions and present clear narratives that would continue to develop over centuries to come. In 1893, the song Christina, the Mad Girl, was about a familiar figure, quote unquote, a familiar figure about the streets of Colón, outlining a bilingual woman of color. There you have the lyrics of the song where this woman is saying, "Señor, I'm not mad," and indigent and low. She's expressing this. She's talking about herself. "Hi, ¿qué es eso música? Listen to the música." This woman is bilingual. And "Dance for you the cumbia. Diga, señor, soy loca." These lyrics stereotype women of color from the Caribbean, which at this time were fully developed. These stereotypes were fully developed thanks to decades of mythicizing African American women in the United States and Europe as naturally hyper-sexy, hypersexual, crazy, angry. And in the Caribbean, black and brown women were at the bottom of the social and cultural hierarchies. The characterization of such women as mad, loca, indigent, and even an association with the cumbia dance form, which strengthened the stereotypes that would invigorate later the culture of oppression against black women in Panama. The use of popular music to reinforce racial or gender stereotypes and other forms of social oppression, including overarching economic system, expanded transnationally to Panama, marginalizing Afro-descendant women in almost every stratum of Caribbean society. But in the 19th century and early 20th century, this was common in the United States to depict black women as wild, primitive, as close to the jungle as possible. Some depictions even show black women inside caves to show the relationship to primitive life with men that have black horns relating them to the devil. Other depictions showed black women taking care of the white babies, which of course did happen during slavery times and later, but always these women are depicted with exaggerated facial characteristics. And of course in Panama, women are depicted with an array of fruit on top of their heads, which is something I've never seen in my over plus 20 years working and living in Panama and traveling all over Panama. Other common depictions include the over-sexualization of black women and brown women and depicting them naked in the jungle, or dancing to lure men, or carelessly naked, or positioned in ways that are ready for intercourse. But here is another song, because now, we're gonna see how the depictions of the music from the early 20th century were of men of color. Here is the Coon with the Panama, which we're gonna hear now, thanks to Global Jazz Women, was composed in 1902 by Jim Vaughan and Tom Lemonnier, with lyrics by Alex Rogers. This song was just one of many featuring black stereotypes that would spread through music and entertainment, penetrate cultural environments, and become accepted as reality. Popular music was a tool through which powerful social structures could internalize stereotypes in the United States so they could also be exported into Panama. This song we're going to play now, the reimagination of that imaginary. And this is a wonderful thing about music, that you can play it as many times as possible and you can actually change whatever you want. And especially in jazz, you can improvise over it. So we're going to hear the Coon with the Panama. Thank you. Thank you to Global Jazz Women. And that was the Coon with the Panama. And the idea of the coon in the United States was a robust cultural tool that originated in song. James Dormont recounted that the disappointment or the force of credulity, an English ballad opera published in the United States in 1767, features a black character called Raccoon. And in his writing, Shaping the Popular Image of Post-Reconstruction American Blacks, coon songs phenomenon of the Gilded Age, Dormont describes how minstrel show performers George Washington Dixon and Bob Farrell claimed to have created the second major black stage figure, the first one being Jim Crow. The ubiquitous Sip Coon, who was to be rendered immortal by the way of song bearing his name in the late 1820s. The Coon with the Panama, the song, well, the first thing we did was take the lyrics out of the song. So that's why you heard this beautiful music, because the lyrics are very racist. The Kun with the Panama helped expand these caricatures of happy black men wearing Ecuadorian Panama hats. The Panama hats are not from Panama. They're made in Ecuador, right? So this song is saying, you know, we're getting more like white folks every day, and what's the style for them is the style for us, and if we don't reach it, we may come mighty close. That's in an accent, obviously. So the Kun with the Panama became a figure that served to imagine African Americans in both the United States and Panama in the roles of entertainers. Camouflage in catchy tunes and memorable lyrics, images like these permeated the collective consciousness of Americans. The Kun with the Panama is an example of that mythological, inarticulate, but in reality bilingual, trilingual, Afro-descendant individual who wanted to be more like white folks, insisting that what is the style for them is the style for us. He's beaming as if about to burst into song and dance. The Panama hat don't even have to be a genuine Panama hat, implying perhaps this man is not even refined enough to recognize the difference. And the subject won't complain if he has got his Panama hat. So this notion is even more demeaning with the historical context of the Caribbean Ring and the southern United States at the time of the song's composition. West Indian workers were fighting for basic housing and healthcare in the Canal Zone, where labor relations so resembled those of the southern part of the United States. So songs like this erase the Pan-Afro-American struggle from public consciousness, replacing it with an image of a troop of buffoon with trivial concerns. I call this process of exporting racism, caricatures, and stereotypes of black men, women, and other peoples from the Caribbean Ring to the Caribbean Ring as, you know, happy-go-lucky entertainers who always have their hands in their pocket because they're never working. They're always smiling, sometimes an exaggerated manner, fashion, always, most of the time. I call this process Jim Crow with the Panama hat, because this caricature was invented by the same sort of imagination that helped create the minstrel shows and the character of Jim Crow in the United States. And we know that the character of Jim Crow was created by a white man in 1828 and was a blackface performance that became very popular in the United States. So popular that we even have laws that are called Jim Crow laws. So the image of the inept, lazy black slave entertaining all the time was adjusted into misleading portrayals of simple-minded black workers in Panama living an easy, carefree life. These images played as propaganda that would aid the United States government in recruiting underpaid labor force for the Caribbean and continuing the legacy of a slavery recently abolished on U.S. soil. So in this way, the same cultural structures of white supremacy that created the character of Jim Crow manifested in Panama, in Jim Crow with the Panama hat. And just as the United States had these stereotypes in media and music in the United States, and also applied cultural oppression around these images, the same happened in Panama. And perhaps the most obvious example would be the silver and gold apartheid system that was developed during the construction of the Panama Canal, where silver and gold system separated workers of the Panama Canal into white workers and black workers. Panama rag. In 1904, the same year the United States began work on the Panama Canal, the Albright Music Company published Panama Rag. The cover page of this piece of music is, of course, a black man with a Panama hat and the Caribbean coming from his head and neck. Water resembles the canal or the river, palm trees. He's, of course, smiling, always relaxed, never working. His hands are always in his pocket. And in reality, at the time, workers, the black workers and the Caribbean workers were building the Panama Canal and working to exhaustion only. And of course, we're going to play now the reimagination of this song, the 21st century version of this song, Panama Rag. And that was Panama Rag. As construction of the Panama Canal began, racial tensions surfaced between the diverse populations of Panamanians, West Indian migrant workers, and the people of the United States. As United States workers of European descent in charge of canal construction became increasingly uncomfortable with the black presence in the area, their overseers used music to whiten the image of Panama. Music, literature, and illustrations began to elevate the image of the white worker from the United States and his effort to construct the canal. Stories circulated about the difficulty of digging the most big hole on earth, and industrious working men with essential skills, centering white men as the heroes undertaking this Herculean task. Authors, poets, journalists in the United States celebrated the efforts of the Panama roughneck or the old canal man, both symbols of hyper-masculine strength, unrelenting work ethics, and Anglo-Saxon superiority. Like all white supremacist narratives, this messaging lionized workers while erasing black ones, helping to hide the apartheid system of gold and silver role imposed in the United States, by the United States in the Panama Canal Zone. In music, this renewed, more European image of Panama displayed the country of a land of dream hours tamed by white male figures. This was the beginning of a far-reaching pattern of cultural whitening that would later appear in Panamanian folkloric music as well. If the image of the man changed, the image of the woman also needed to change. Spanish señoritas began appearing in songs, serving as companions and lovers for workers of European descent. The introduction of desirable pallid women in the image of Panama necessitated the construction of a new image of the other. The music positioned Panama as an extension of a nation rising to greatness and global eminence, imagining Panama as a welcoming, seductive space for audiences in the United States, and carefully spinning the story of the Panama Canal and the land around it to soothe the fears and stoke the desires of white listeners. In 1909, George Publishing Company from Boston, Massachusetts, published a song titled "The Man Who Sung a Pig at Panama." The cover page advertises the song as the song that is sweeping the canal zone, and features an image captioned that says number 503, drilling under the ledge of rock at Pedro Miguel Lock. This is a place inside the Panama Canal Zone. The photo shows a group of men with their backs turned to the camera. They are swinging their axes and moving debris beside a railroad track. A young man with light skin is standing on the tracks, hand clasped behind his back, looking at the camera. Beside this image is a drawing of a white man with his arm folded. His picks are resting against a rock behind him. His gaze is turned toward the photo of the workers at Pedro Miguel Locks. And this song is intended for U.S. audiences, and this song and the imagery on the cover construct a vision of a new national hero, a tough, hard-working man driven by a soldierly sense of nationalist duty, and effectively erases the thousands of Afro-Caribbean workers who made the canal possible. This is just a very important image because the Jim Crow with the Panama hat disappears from popular music, and the image of the white hero starts appearing in the songs. If the image of the man changed, the image of the woman had to change too. So white women are always depicted, and when I say white women are really light-skinned women from Panama, which are mostly of mixed ethnicity, and those could be indigenous, Spanish, and any other nationality from the incredible amount of migrations, Chinese, Hindu, African, American, and many others. So, but light-skinned women. These women were always depicted as romantic lovers that were waiting for their U.S. soldiers. The title Peggy from Panama was not an accident. Peggy was a common nickname for a Panamanian lover. The name designates a woman in this song as a symbol, standing for all the Panamanian women courted by men from the United States during the Panama Canal construction. The cover of the sheet music shows a thin, light-skinned woman all the time, dressed in white dress, a mythical Panamanian woman who is, quote, the sweetest girl you ever saw, the girl I love the most. And these things come from the lyrics of the songs. But then we see that in the case of Peggy from Panama, the song that you see there, the cover, she stands alone at the end of the relationship. Let's say, he's saying goodbye to her lover. And so during the years of following the completion of the Panama Canal, that's 1914, music helped change the image of Panama from that of an Herculean construction project burdened by yellow fever and accidents to a dream land full of women, love, and beauty. And women came to do this, to change that narrative. And the successful construction of the Panama Canal was proof that the United States could also master the chaos of the tropics. So you see here that the tropics are depicted very nicely ordered. There's not chaos. These songs that talk about women created an imaginary woman from Panama, a monolithic in form and meaning. These patriarchal and capitalistic ideas about women are on full display, also with the image of the men who are controlling every situation, social, economic, emotional. So this creation of a static, vulnerable, intimate other waiting for her rescue places agency squarely, of course, in men, valorizing mobile masculinity, meaning that the man is the one who moves from the United States to Panama, back and forth from the Caribbean ring, and women are stagnant. The feminine side is depicted as something stagnant, always waiting, not moving from the place where they are. In this song, Those Panama Mamas, this is a song that talks about, silver star, palm trees, and left behind remain the central topics of all these songs, until this song called Those Panama Mamas Are Ruining Me. This breaks the pattern and explores the imaginary of that manipulative Latino woman who uses her charm to control men. The narrative returns to the theme of chaos in Panama through the image now of the woman. And the cover presents, as you see here, a light-skinned woman dressed in red with jewelry on her neck and wrist, controlling a puppet, the puppet of a man with her right hand. And of course, in the background, there is the Caribbean, palm trees, cloud, water, construct the new image of Panama as a tropical heaven, but be careful because there is some trouble in paradise. Now, all this imaginary Panama is being sung, is being played all over the place in the United States and in Panama and in the Canal Zone. But while the Panamanians were very busy being creative, creating music, composing, playing. As early as 1860, Panamanian bands were formed to assert the sovereignty of the country and express the desire for independence and political freedom. In 1867, the first iteration of the Banda Republicana formed under the name of Banda de la Música de la Guardia del Estado Soberano del Istmo de Panamá. These bands were very important. Banda Republicana has always been linked to the Panamanian nation as a cultural pillar, and it endures until today. The band, imagine this band were in the 1860s, providing not only music education and a venue for music performance and a space for the development of popular music, but a strong link between music and the concept of nation building. Panamanians express their sovereignty in their musical lives. And many of the directors and musicians who founded the Banda Republicana created long lines of musical ancestry. Many musicians who perform in the band went on to play in salsa and jazz bands later. In fact, many of the instruments used by local musicians, like the trumpet or the saxophone, came from these early bands called Banda Republicana and Banda del Cuerpo de Bomberos. In 1891, the Band of Firefighters of Panama, or Banda de Música del Cuerpo de Bomberos de Panamá, parade for the first time in Panamanian Suite with second-hand instruments bought in pawn shops and repaired for the event, performing music under the motto discipline, honor, abnegation. The Band of Firefighters also helped create a school of band musicians that trained vocalists, drummers, cornetists, and other instruments that would later be part of the popular orchestras and the jazz band format. Many of the jazz musicians of Panama have parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who belong to these bands or were taught by music teachers who came from this school. We actually have somebody who actually has a family that comes from the Banda del Cuerpo de Bomberos from 1892, and she's going to tell her story later. By the beginning of the 20th century, we can see marching bands like this one in the picture, which the exact instruments of the jazz band. They were what I call pre-jazz bands. This picture was taken in Bocas del Toro, Panama, between 1907 and 1919, and it is a religious procession of the United Methodist Church mission in Central America. The steady flow of movement brought Pan-Afro-American and European musics in constant contact, sparking innovation. By the time the 20th century arrived, Panama was a cosmopolitan nexus where diverse new forms of music thrived. Here's a picture of the Tropical Jazz Kings Orchestra that was active in Colón from at least 1924. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the Americas saw the hybridization of many popular music, blues, ragtime, habanera, tango, machiche, and many other Latin rhythms, developing into a distinctive style called jazz. Panama, a multicultural center even before World War I, was a frequent host of performances by prominent musicians from Europe and the United States. Many people like Dexter Gordon, Ella Fitzgerald, many people from the United States would stop in Panama to do concerts, obviously, from the very beginning of jazz. A confluence of music, people, and resources nourished the cosmopolitan music scene of Panama and the strong jazz community on the Istmo. Beginning as early as the mid-1800s, instruments and newly published sheet music flowed from the United States to Bocas del Toro, Panama, with new shipments arriving every 1 or 2 weeks. The musicians were well equipped on the cutting edge of the music developing in the United States, the Panamanian musicians. So the Panama Canal drew a steady flow of US soldiers, musicians, cultural agents that kept Panamanians informed on the popular music and dances trending in the United States. Here is another picture of Nesbitt and his rhythm makers from Bocas del Toro. They were famous in the 1930s and 40s. There we have the band, and we actually see how these early jazz bands in Panama even included a maraca player. Before I move into the second movement of this Panamanian Suite, I would like to perform one more song from the first movement called Under a Panama. I'm not going to go through the lyrics of Under Panama because I think we got the point of the first movement of this Panamanian Suite. And I would like to move on into the second movement called jazz. The second movement called jazz, I talk in the book about the Caribbean migrations that flowed between Europe, New York, Boston, New Orleans to Panama, Port Limon, Guatemala, and Honduras. These movements were cyclical in nature. A person may pass through each place at least once in each season of life, and their children may do the same. This steady flow of movement brought Pan-Afro-American and European music into constant contact, sparking innovation. By the time the 20th century arrived, Panama was a cosmopolitan nexus where diverse new forms of music like jazz thrived. The relationship between Panama and New Orleans and Harlem was especially significant as British West Indians became the majority of migrants in both places, Panama and Harlem, creating a web of cultural connections that play key roles in the prolific musical innovations of the 20th century. In the 1920s, Panama, and later, Panama was instrumental in the development of jazz in the United States, but its part in the history of music have been omitted from retellings. So in this second movement, I would like to explore that lost history of Panamanian identity in jazz. Jazz is not a monolith or the sole intellectual property of the United States, I say. In this chapter, I argue that jazz is a cultural hybrid that traveled back and forth between two nations, Panama and the United States, not to mention others, of course, many others, developing distinctive styles in each locales. Thanks to the close ties between the United States and Panama, there was an exceptionally great deal of crosstalk between the musicians of these two nations as jazz developed. Numerous musicians of jazz became significant figures in jazz in the United States and Panama. Born in 1915 in Panama, Colón, Panama, Margarita Benskina, Princess Aurelia, contributed to the Pan-Afro-Latin American artistic scene in New York in the 1930s and shared the stage with Louis Armstrong, dancing regularly at the Apollo Theater, Copacabana, and Carnegie Hall. Louis Russell was a Panamanian who moved to the New Orleans, and he made so many incredible advancements in jazz history. He revolutionized, for example, recording technique by introducing a musical fade at the end of a performance. Louis Russell was the first black artist to record the George and Ira Gershwin composition, I Got Rhythm. He was also the musical director of Louis Armstrong in the 1930s. And then after leaving Louis Armstrong in 1943, Louis Russell helped to invent the cross-marketing of music and sports and entertainment when his former orchestra became the first musical group to tour extensively with major sport figures and celebrations, including Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion of the world. Louis Russell is considered the pioneer, kind of the first person who was very well known and who became the musical director of a figure like Louis Armstrong. His band's name actually was changed from the Louis Russell Orchestra to the Louis Armstrong Orchestra because Louis Armstrong manager wanted to change the name, and Louis Russell agreed to that. So, in a way, Louis Armstrong had this amazing orchestra that was very important in the history of jazz, and Louis Russell was the director and one of the first pioneers of jazz from Panama. I think we may know another giant, Randy Weston, who devoted his life to maintaining a musical connection with Africa. And he said in his autobiography that his dad told him many years later that when he was in Panama working as a kid, he overheard some pianists playing inside a restaurant as he was walking past, and he made the habit of going past this place because he loved to hear this guy play piano. So he thought that maybe a seed was planted in his mind, and he wanted, therefore, to his son to have access to the piano and be a pianist. He actually was honored by the Panama Jazz Festival in 2016, and he actually went to Panama and found his passport, the passport of his father, and he became a Panamanian citizen when he was 80-something, almost 90 years old. Another person of Panamanian origin was Eric Dolphy. He was an extraordinary composer, improviser, innovator who expanded jazz beyond the developments of bebop. He had a remarkable role in jazz. He was born to Panamanian immigrants in Los Angeles and moved to New York in 1959. And he grew into a remarkable musician who collaborated with some of the most significant recordings of his time, Charles Mingus, Ornette Coleman, and of course, John Coltrane. But he did die at an early age. So, his Panamanian roots were never told about. Other Panamanian figures include saxophonist Carlos Garnett, who was born in Panama in 1938 and performed with Miles Davis in the 1970s, and of course with many other people, Freddie Hubbard, Pharoah Sanders, Woody Shaw, Art Blakey, Charles Mingus, etc. Another big figure was Billy Coban, who was actually honored at the Panama Jazz Festival this year, and he's, right? Remember him? We hung with him in Panama for a week, and we had a great time. But he's considered one of the most influential fusion drummers today. And again, he's from Panama, and very few people know that he comes from Panama. Mauricio Smith is another eminent Panamanian multi-instrumentalist and flute virtuoso who was born in 1931 in Panama, coming from a musical family, which is actually a common theme in this Panamanian Suite. His father was classically trained musician from Banda Republicana, and insisted that his son learn Western music and jazz music from an early age. We have other incredible musicians like trumpet player Victor Paz, who performed with everyone in New York, from Count Basie to Bill Evans, and he was described by Chas Smith as a pillar of the Latin jazz trumpet. And Victor Paz also came from a musical family, and his father was a master musician in Panama. He arrived in New York City in 1963. And all these people, when they arrived into the United States, either New York or New Orleans or any other place, they were already great musicians. These are not people that came here to learn, but they came here to play. They came here to play in less than 5 years. They were all over the place. They were playing with everyone. In the case of Victor Paz, for example, he played with Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, Ray Charles, Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, everyone. And this was common for Panamanian musicians to play with, to be part of the greatest jazz bands of the 60s, 70s, and also starting with Louis Russell, even the 1920s and 30s. Another two figures are Alex Blake and family. Here we have Alex Blake Jr. We also, at the Panama Jazz Festival, honored Alex Blake's father and his two sons, who are also great musicians. The Alex Blake you're seeing here was actually the bass player for Randy Weston for a long time. Frank Anderson, who was one of the musicians who was born at the beginning of the 20th century in Bocas del Toro, and he was one of the ones who also told me that he would be, in Bocas del Toro, the musicians who lived there would be the first one who got the music that just got published in Panama a week later, because you remember we had ships going from New York and New Orleans to Panama every week, pretty much. and Sonny White, who is an interesting, very important also pianist, who was born in Panama City in 1917. He moved to the United States and began performing with Sidney Bechet, whose band included at that time Dizzy Gillespie. So he also played with Artie Shaw, Benny Carter, Lena Horne, Dexter Gordon, among other musicians. And he was thought to be very advanced, a very advanced musician. Again, when he came to the United States, he was already a great musician because of the musical interactions in Panama. And he's famous, let's say, because he played piano on the song Strange Fruit, one of Billie Holiday's most popular and powerful recordings. Strange Fruit is considered to be the first significant song of the civil rights movements and the first direct musical assault upon racial lynchings in the southern part of the United States. So Sonny White would have understood the meaning of this music quite well because of that Pan-Afro-American revolutionary movements that moved black activists between the United States and Panama since at least the 1850s. Here are some other significant musicians who are younger, and you can see them also. They may be in New York right now. Ramon Morris, who performed with Art Blakey, Woody Shaw, and Guillermo Edding, bass player for Mongo Santa Maria, Santri Di Briano, whose father was also a pioneer of a type of calypso jazz, and he moved to Panama with his family in the 1950s. He performed with Artie Shipp, Sam River, Pharoah Sanders, Freddie Hubbard, many other jazz greats. Carlos Ward, Jorge Silvestre, they're all people that are there in New York at the moment. From the earliest days of its history, Panama's jazz scene has harbored a global perspective, owing to the steady stream of foreign stars who pass through on tour. In the cosmopolitan spaces of Panama, jazz was informed by multilingualism. Most musicians could speak or understand English, Spanish, and other languages from the Caribbean ring, including French and Creole. This same versatility characterized the musicianship. The best Panamanian musicians slept many times in one set between jazz, gospel, calypso, and many different Latin styles with ease. The constant collision of various cultures gave rise to a Panamanian tinge called tambo jazz, which brought the sounds, rhythms, dances, and tambor into the context of jazz improvisation. Its influence is audible in both popular and folkloric Panamanian music of today. We can see some of the distinguished tambo jazz musicians who are the musicians who developed jazz inside Panama with this very Latin tinge based on many styles from many parts of the Caribbean. Here we have Barbara Wilson, Violeta Green, Victor Boa, Clarence Martin, and Idania Dowman, who is the one in the middle. And of course, we cannot forget Danilo Perez. Danilo Perez, who is also Panamanian. And before we go into our next part of the story, I would like to invite Global Jazz Womex to play one of Danilo's songs called Galactic Panama. Thank you to Global Jazz Wemex, and that was Galactic Panama from by Danilo Perez. But you know why? The question is why the musicians noted in this chapter and the next are rarely identified as Panamanian or even people as people of Latin American origin. So that is a big question. And this is, and I pose some answers for that question. First, the why is because the cultural history and politics of Panama contains the history of transatlantic slavery. From the first Africans arriving on the American continent in the early 1500s to Bayano's slave revolt to the passing of Marcus Garvey in 1911, key aspects of such complex and turbulent cultural history are commonly overshadowed or suppressed in the process of constructing modern narratives. This ignorance is not an oversight, but a continuation of a long history of erasing Pan-African movements that gave birth to various forms of cultural development, including jazz. As Panamanian scholar Marixa Lasso informs us about the erasure of the history of the Panamanian towns that used to inhabit the canal zone before the construction of the Panama Canal, quote, the story of the depopulation of the canal zone is the history of political rather than technical decisions. And similarly, I think that the erasure of Panamanian heritage from jazz is a political action. By erasing the history of Panamanians in jazz, people erase the cultural contributions of Caribbean migrants to jazz, but also to the United States, whose contributions are part of the, so when these contributions are part of the discourse, academic discourse or other discourses, the transatlantic slave trade and the silver and gold roll apartheid system that was created in the canal zone by the United States become the socioeconomic and the cultural structures that define the narrative. Second, the second reason for the denial of the Panamanians' entry into jazz history has to do with the popular perception of Panama as a nation. Since the discovery of the Pacific Ocean in 1513 by Vasco Núñez de Balboa, Panama has been viewed more as what French philosopher Marc Auger calls a non-place, a passage way for the world, a no man's land to be claimed by colonizing Spaniards, purchased by the United States, or simply ignored by cultural scholars. European empires and the United States tampered with the region for 5 centuries, imagining and reshaping Panama as a railroad or as a hat, then as a canal, then as the crossroads of America. So the Isthmus became an incubator for supermodernity. Panama is too often described and embedded in global consciousness as a place of transit. It has become a point on a map almost with no historical memory. Third, there exists, we have the idea that jazz is America's classical music and that United States is the only great contributor to jazz and also to global culture. In the process of constructing this narrative, many historians, scholars, and critics have overlooked, dismissed, and downplayed the existence of significant early jazz scenes outside of the United States, outside of US borders. And Panama has been an important part of the transnational Pan-Afro-Latin musical connections from which jazz emerged. So any thorough analysis of jazz, of the history of jazz, must acknowledge that jazz was a collective participant experiment born of a much larger community of Africans who came to the America. And that means tracing jazz roots beyond the border of the United States and unearthing the connections neglected in previous retelling of its history. So when one approaches jazz with this lens, a host of remarkable Panamanian musicians and their contributions emerge. The fourth element has to do with political suppression and the history of politics directed towards Afro-Caribbean migrants, both in Panama and the United States. And I mentioned that Afro-Caribbeans who worked on the Panama Canal were actually sent back home after the completion of the Panama Canal. The United States and Panama did not want to give them citizenship, so they wanted them to go back to Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the islands of the other islands of the Caribbean that they came from. And last but not least, this is a point that is not in the book, but that I learned actually right after I submitted my manuscript, and then I couldn't get it back. I was like, no. But I'm going to say it here because this is very important. I read this book called Anarchist Territory, Sailor Geographies and New Granada's Trans-Imperial Grade in Caribbean World by Ernesto Bassi. And Ernesto Bassi, in this book, I learned that Panama was a very important Caribbean port in the 1700s and 1800s, where lots of illegal merchandise, including enslaved Africans, would escape, or gold would get lost, or merchandise would become part of the legal markets of the day. So everything that happened in Panama had to be erased in a way, because Panama was a central port for illegal transactions and also was a place for the rebellions of people. And where the empires, the European and United States empires, didn't have much control of what happened. So this practice of erasing the accounting books transferred to jazz history, as Panama was also a port that developed this incredibly cosmopolitan space where bars, prostitution, nightlife, and of course, jazz developed at the beginning of the 20th century. I'd like to end the second movement of this suite with a song, Panama Twilight. This is a reimagination of this song, and this song was composed in 1922 and by Fisher Thompson with lyrics by Wilbur Delia. And Global Jazz Women will perform the last song, because then we're going to go into the third movement of the suite. Please say thank you to this amazing global jazz Wemex. Sahili Zamora from Cuba on piano. Kira Moser from Austria on bass. Lihi Harubi from Israel on saxophone. On flute from Slovakia, Lenka Molkanjova. I'm getting better. And drums, Ivana Cuesta from the Dominican Republic. Thank you so much for your amazing, beautiful music. I want to say about this movement called global jazz and the relationship with the redressing actions of Caribbean, Afro-Caribbeans and Panamanians in general. The regressing actions towards jazz. But also, I want to mention that by global, we do not imply that globalization of jazz is something new. We know that the DNA of jazz is actually transnational. Is in many different parts of the world. But global jazz, the concept of global jazz is about choosing to concentrate in the new forms of musical globalizations that emerged from the 1990s. And what defines the new era of global jazz is its emergence from the collision of jazz with the socio-economic and cultural phenomena of hyper-globalization. So since the 1990s, expanded access to other cultures and other musics afforded by cheap travel and the internet has nurtured new styles of music, such as the folkloric musics of the world, the blues. They react to one another. And in this sense, some people think that hyperglobalization has boosted proximity. Some scholars believe that it has also helped with connectivity and interaction. And of course, we live that and we know that. But also, along with this cultural hybridity and heterogeneity, globalization has also amplified cultural imperialism. So I talk about that in the last part of the book. And I also mention a couple of very important things in the context of Panama, how this globalization also plays a role in the politics of Panama. And I go over the music of the invasion of Panama and the connection between popular music and violence, especially within the history of the United States-Panama relationship. I can go deep into this because this is in the book. You may need to read the book to find that out because I need to finish also. I also go over Danilo Perez Urriola, who is the father of Danilo Perez, who is there. You see it in the big picture. That tiny little thing, tiny little baby in the middle is actually Danilo. Yes, way. He was like, I don't know, 4. And he was playing congas in that band of men. So I go actually over the thesis that he wrote for the School of Pedagogy of Panama in 1968 called The Influence of Music in Primary Education. And I talk about his book and the importance of his book in the development, of course, of Danilo, but also the development of Panama and the development of everyone he touched in Panama, including all these musicians, including all these jazz musicians. And he said in 1968 that music was so important for society and for the children that we needed a paradigm shift around the importance of music and social development. He notes that music can aid the development of children and states that music education should not only be considered an isolated subject of study, but a tool to educate the whole mind and body, express feelings, build character, and develop skills. He claims that music can help solve disciplinary issues and, if used effectively, strengthen and nourish the brain and expose children to the beauty of rhythm and rhyme, leaving an effective and lasting influence of their mind, body, and spirit. He insists that music can work as a framework for experiencing one's elementary school years and is of central importance in the development of a well-integrated mind. I go over this thesis because it's very important, because it's pretty much what Danilo also learned later from his mentors, Dizzy Gillespie and Wayne Shorter. But there is the connection for many years with Panama, and this is again the connection between the oral Pan-Afro-American tradition of jazz that is so obvious, let's say, in Panama and the United States. I also talk in the book about the Panama Jazz Festival and how Panama Jazz Festival became a redressing action. This festival was founded in 2003 by Danilo and became the first massive international festival in Panama City. And this was the cultural engine for Panama after decades of trying to recover from the U.S. invasion in 1989. And I go deep into the U.S. invasion. I can't explain too much now because we don't have a lot of time. But after the invasion, of course, the country was pretty much depleted. The culture was erased for like 10 years and it was very difficult to recover. So the Panama Jazz Festival became the tool for the recovery, the redressing action. This year we had at the Panama Jazz Festival over 41,000 attendees, over 3,000 students, over 300 musicians from all over the world, over 1,000 people working and collaborating with us in our team, in our staff. And since 2003, we have announced more than $5 million in scholarships to some of the best, for admissions and scholarships, and to some of the best schools of the Americas, including Berklee. Then I go little by little into the subject of global jazz and how this oral tradition of jazz got passed from generation to generation through important figures like Dizzy Gillespie, and his teaching, of course, through the way via Danilo Perez, and now to all the students that are part of the Global Jazz Institute. We go through that actually in my class called Global Jazz and Music Social Activism. So also I go in the book, I talk about the Wayne Shorter Quartet and explain how the new musical knowledge that was inherited again via oral tradition by from Wayne Shorter and Carolina Shorter. You may know that they were actually founding members of the Berklee Global Jazz Institute Advisory Board, and a person who dared Danilo to make the world a place we wanted to live in and enjoy and have creative lives. So what has happened over the years is that all this knowledge, and I'm talking about the knowledge, coming from Panama too, and I don't want to leave this out of jazz history, because we have already left many things that are Panamanian and Latin American identity outside of the history of Panama. So I want to make sure that we know that the concept of global jazz is related to Latin America in general and Panama in particular, and also always through the lens of a jazz master, in this case of Wayne Shorter. And here I end the book with the concept of global jazz and how the BGJI came to be the Global Jazz Institute, and I introduce concepts that were practiced by the Wayne Shorter Quartet for over 20 years, which are concepts that we teach at the Global Jazz Institute, concepts such as zero gravity, comprovisation, fear training, UFO material, and other harmonic concepts that have been evolving for over 30 years in Danilo's piano music room and on the stages of the world. And also a very important work that Danilo has been doing at the Global Jazz Institute that now is being done at Berklee is the new harmonic considerations from improvisation, methodologies that are based on tetrachordal harmony that expand our harmonic system, our ears, and create alternative music theories that are based on the Latin American experiences, on the Pan-Afro-American thought, and also on the colonial methodology. So this is a book that, this is actually a book that Danilo is authoring, and he's been developing this book on harmonic considerations for a long time, for more than 20 years, and it's also hopefully will be published soon, and we all will have access to these alternative, what I call alternative music theories. And this book will be soon published by Danilo and edited. The book has been edited by Ches Mooring. So these are some of the books that have been important for me to understand the history of Latin America, the history of jazz, the history of Pan-Afro-American movements, but also my own history. My own history and how I play myself is important. One is Uneven Encounters from Nicole Siegel. She talks about jazz, the relationship between jazz and machixe, who is a rhythm from Brazil from the early 20th century. Radical Moves by Lara Putnam, who talks about Caribbean migrants and the politics of race in the jazz era. And of course, the seminal, one of the most important books in everything that has to do with post-colonialism, Edward Said, Orientalism. Because we have to finish, because we're taking a break and then we're having an amazing panel at 1 p.m., I want to send you to the website called PanamanianSuite.com, which is a website where you will find all the music played today, all the music. This is, of course, you can't really put 200 years of music in one book. So there's a lot, even more music than in the book. We have managed to actually transcribe all the music. I have direct links to the original music written in the 1880s, in the 1920s, and you can find the book obviously on Amazon and Roman and Litchfield. Please go to the website because I have a discount code that you can use if you want to buy the book. So